In the last section, we put together our first configuration file to create a deployment. In this section, we're going to walk through the configuration file and talk about a couple of interesting things that's inside of here. Now again, the first two lines that you see specify the API version and the object type that we want to create. So in this case, we're making an object of type deployment. After that, we see a very familiar metadata section that names the object that's going to be created by this configuration file. So in our case, our deployment will have a name of client-deployment. Now down in the specs section, I want to skip on down to the template property right here. So inside the template, we're listing out the configuration that is going to be used for every single pod that is created by this deployment. The entire template section right here probably looks a little bit familiar to some of the configuration that we put together inside of our client-pod.yaml file. So back inside of client-pod, we had a label, we had a list of containers assigned as well. And so you can essentially imagine that this template section right here is defining the exact configuration that should be used for every pod that is created and maintained by this deployment. Every pod that gets created by this deployment will have a label of component web, and it will have a container with the name of client and using the image multi-client with a port 3000 mapped up to that container. Now, besides the template right here, the other properties that are kind of interesting is replicas and selector. So first off, replicas. As you might guess, this is specifying the number of different pods that this deployment is supposed to make. And remember, every one of those pods that it creates are going to be absolutely identical in nature. So at this point, we are saying, hey, deployment, create exactly one pod using this template down here. If we wanted to, we could very easily change this up to something like 5. That means that we would want to create 5 separate pods, each of which run this exactly identical template. We're going to leave replicas as 1 for right now, however. Now, the other thing that's kind of interesting inside of here is the selector. The selector looks very similar to a selector property that we previously put into our node port file. So back over here, we had a selector property as well. Let's talk about what the selector is. Essentially, it's doing something very similar to what the selector inside of the service configuration file was doing. You see, when a deployment creates a pod, it doesn't directly create the pod itself and maintain it. Instead, the deployment reaches out to the Kubernetes API on the master and it says, hey, master, I need you to create a pod for me, and here's the configuration for it. The master then goes ahead and creates the pod. Now, it's the master or some program inside the master that is creating the pod for us. And so the deployment, after the pod is created, needs to somehow get a handle on the pod that is created. And that's the purpose of that selector field. The deployment says, okay, I'm going to ask master or some program in master to create this pod for me. After it gets created, I need to somehow get a handle on it. And so to get a handle on that newly created pod, I'm going to look for objects with a label of component web. And so, of course, every pod that we are creating using this deployment is going to have a label of component web, because that's what we specified inside of our template. And so matched labels and selector right here, this section right here is essentially giving us a handle on this label down here. I know it seems a little bit repetitive to have to kind of like designate this stuff twice inside the same file, but it's entirely possible that we might have multiple labels assigned to our deployment, or excuse me, multiple labels assigned to the pod that is created by our deployment, and maybe we only want our deployment to look for 1 or 2 very specific labels out of those. So that's why you're seeing it kind of replicated here twice. Okay, so that's pretty much it for our deployment configuration file. So let's take a quick pause right here. We'll come back to the next section, and we're going to apply this deployment file to our Kubernetes cluster by using kubectl, and then we'll very quickly be able to look at a couple of interesting things around the deployment and the pod that is created with it. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.